depression symptoms, and how to know when it's time to see a therapist. So, one thing that I think is very important for me to do is to differentiate the difference between being sad and being depressed. And yes, those two are totally different. And I want to make sure you guys know that. So, what is being sad? Well, being sad is something that is a common emotion that many of us feel. An example would be someone failing a test, right? Let's say you spent thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars taking a professional test. It could be a test to get some type of license, like I did to become a therapist, or someone else taking a license to become a lawyer, like whatever the case it may be. Taking that test, failing it after you spent thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours studying, and still failing it, yes, you would be sad, right? That's one example. Even an example such as it raining on a day where you were supposed to go to the beach if you live like in a beachy town like I do, like here in South Florida. Or let's say you had a cookout and you had it planned, it was a birthday party or some type of celebration event, and it ended up being rained out, right? Like typically, like those things would cause sadness. I remember one time I got sad, and it's kind of random, but there was a concert down here in Miami and Drake was coming. It wasn't the recent one, but it was when Drake came with the Three Amigos. He just did his album called Scorpion, and he canceled. He had to reschedule it for the next month, and I was a little bummed out about that, right? Like Drake is one of my favorite rappers, right? Like that is being sad, right? Like we all feel that emotion, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. And in my previous podcast, maybe 2 podcasts ago, I talked about how negative thoughts actually do not cause depression and how negative thoughts can actually lead to positive actions. And it's the same thing with sadness. When you're finding yourself feeling sad, if you look underneath that sadness, it'll tell you that there's something there that you care about that's missing. So therefore, since we now know what it is that's missing, we need to develop a plan to actually go and get those things. And there's another podcast I did earlier. I can't remember the number, but I talked about how to make hard goals easy to accomplish. That's another podcast I would love for you guys to check out just to help you with those 2 things. So what is depression, right? And that's what this podcast is all about, because I want to give you guys a deep dive into what it is so you can identify it, whether it's in yourself or others, and then so you can find out, hey, when is it time for you guys to get help, all right? So one of the biggest things that you need to know when it comes to depression is that when it comes to the symptoms, you must feel these symptoms for at least 2 weeks, okay? And that's one of the biggest difference between sadness and depression. It's all about that duration. How long is that feeling there? We can also say the intensity of that feeling, and you'll see that from some of the symptoms that I'm going to go over. But one of the biggest things I want to start off with is when you're feeling, let's say, sad for 2 weeks, right? And that's just one part of it. Now, I'm going to go through a list of symptoms, and if you identify with any 5 of these symptoms, then that may be a sign that, hey, you are clinically depressed, and we need to go and find a therapist for you. Now, also, this is a side note. I didn't want to add this. I had no plan in adding this, but I do want to throw it in. There are different types of depression, right? So you have major depressive disorder, right? Like where there's almost like a chemical imbalance within the mind, right? Within the brain, right? Like that is one form of depression. You also have an adjustment disorder with depression. So this is when someone passes. You move from New York to Miami and you don't have any friends down here, and you left all your friends and family in New York, right? Like that's a big adjustment. You breaking up with your girlfriend, or when kids have a divorce, right? When their parents have a divorce, when there's some type of major life change, that could lead to depression. Also, you have bipolar depression, right? Where you have the highs and lows of essentially like your mind, if you will. And I wish I had a better way to say that, but it's when you have these really high highs. And when you see this is when someone is very jumpy. They have a lot of energy. They may decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to drive from Atlanta to Washington State nonstop. So these are called manic episodes, right? Where they have these huge bursts of energy, right? But then what can happen, or what does happen, is that they switch, right? It's like a light switch is flipped. And they go from having these huge bursts of energy to now having no energy, experiencing these really, really low lows, or in other words, the depression. And that's why it's called bipolar. I know a lot of times people joke around and say, man, you're acting bipolar, when someone switches and they're acting totally different. That's what they mean. And I just thought another one, even schizophrenia has a component of depression, right? Like it can come off and look like depression, if you will, right? And there's so much more. Even PTSD, right? Like PTSD can show depressive signs as well. So there's many different types of depression. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you guys the classic signs of just regular depression. All right, and this comes straight from the holy Bible of therapists and mental health. We call it the DSM-5. You don't need to know that. But again, my goal is to show you the signs of depression so you can realize them, you can identify them quickly, and then you can actually go and find the help that you need. So one of the first ones is depressed mood. And it's very simple, something that you've seen from other people. And it may be linked to an idea of sadness, right? When your mood is just down, all right? Now, I know I just said that sadness doesn't equal depression, but it's when you find yourself sad for 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks or more. That is where, okay, this is a sign that maybe depression is present. Another one is having a loss of interest or pleasure in things that you initially or originally had thrills in, right? Things that you enjoy. This is what we call anhedonia, okay? Anhedonia. This is where if you used to enjoy playing basketball, playing video games, reading books, going out with friends, right? Like all these things that you used to find pleasure. When you stop having pleasure in those things, that is another tall tale sign that depression may be lurking. Now, with these next few symptoms that I give you, one thing that's a requirement is that you have to have at least one of those first two that's present in addition to 4 other symptoms that I'm about to give. So again, depressed mood, so you're feeling sad for the course of 2 weeks, or there's a loss of pleasure, loss of interest in things that you used to find interest and pleasure in. Another one, and this one's kind of sneaky, but I hear this a lot from people who are depressed, but when you have a significant weight change or change in appetite. So if you ever seen someone at a funeral, or if you've ever been to a funeral, right, and that's definitely a tough thing to experience, you may find that it's hard to eat, or you may not feel like eating while everybody else is eating after the burial and all that stuff. Everybody's having fun. And you typically see this in movies where, whether it's the mom or the dad or some family member, they're in the kitchen cooking for everyone, right? They're trying to stay busy, but they're not eating anything. And then typically a character from the movie comes and say, hey, come sit down. Get off your feet. Let us take care of it. And they say, no, no. And the reason why is because they want to stay busy. But also they're just simply not hungry because they don't have that appetite, if you will. And when you're not eating, when you don't have that appetite, you will find yourself losing weight. I can also look on the flip side of that, and someone that may be depressed may be overeating, right? So that's why I want to say weight change or appetite change. It doesn't mean that you're not eating or whatever the case may be, but it can be just a simple change in appetite, whether it increases or decreases. Next, and here's a common one. You may experience this as well at times, but it doesn't mean that you're depressed, but it's something that we all commonly experience, but it's sleep disturbances, right? So suffering from insomnia, if you will, right? So not being able to sleep. And believe it or not, I run into a lot of clients who actually suffer from sleep apnea, and they don't use their machines because it's uncomfortable. And believe me when I say, if you're not resting, if you're not sleeping, that in itself could also lead to depression, because now you're going through the day tired. You're not, recharged. You're not energized like you should. And because of that, you're not taking care of the business and the tasks that you should. And that can be overwhelming, especially if you start to see the task start to mount on top of you. So that is a big one. So your sleep, be on the lookout. And this is why having a sleep schedule, just like you have a morning routine, you need to have a sleep routine as well. That is very helpful. And I will tell you, it is important that you wake up at the same time during the week as you do during the weekend. All right. Keep those times the same. That way your body is just already pre-programmed to know at 7 a.m., 6 a.m., 5 a.m., I should be up. This is training your internal clock. All right. This next one, you may be unaware of it. You may have seen it, if you will, but it's psychomotor agitation. So what this means is when people start to slow down, they start to look very lethargic or be essentially almost stuck, almost like figures, if you will, like wax figures. And what this looks like, there's a term for it. It's called catatonic behavior. And this is where, if you've ever seen videos on like Instagram, YouTube, where you see people on the street, like homeless people essentially, and they're in these like weird poses where maybe they're crouched over or they're slumped over, if you will, and they're just not moving. Okay. Now I know I'm using an example such as homeless people, but obviously not all homeless people are dealing with the mental illness, and people who are not homeless, they also deal with mental illness. Okay. I'm just giving that as an example. So again, psychomotor agitation is basically where like you're stuck in a pose, right? Like you're just not physically moving. You've slowed down, looking lethargic, or looking at it as if you're stuck in a posture, okay? And that may be something that you may not see as much, but it is a symptom of depression. Another one is fatigue, and I kind of alluded to that earlier. When you're not sleeping, naturally, you're gonna start to feel fatigue. You're gonna feel a sense of like lost energy, and from there, you're not gonna be taking the actions that you should. There's a great way to combat this, and also a lot of these, if you will, and it's called behavioral activation. And I would love for you to Google that, okay? Behavior activation basically, it states that when you do something that's meaningful, you'll start to feel good about yourself. And when you start to feel good about yourself, it's going to make you want to do that same thing that gave you that positive feeling over and over and over again. So it's like a cycle. But what happens is the exact opposite cycle has the ability to take place, where if you allow these feelings of feeling sad, feeling depressed, feeling down to stop you from taking action, guess what you're not going to do? You're not going to take action. And what that's going to lead to is feeling more depressed, right? So there's these cycles that we find ourselves in, and all you have to do is be present. And I talked about that in a previous podcast. All you have to do is be present enough to take one small action and build from there. If you do that, you will look up one day and find that you have the life that you've always dreamed of right in front of you. All right, here's another one, okay? And this is the seventh one. So feeling a sense of worthlessness or guilt. A great example of this comes from survivor's remorse. So here in South Florida, there's an unfortunate shooting that happened at Parkland, okay? And you guys may have heard of it at Stoneman Douglas, if you will. You may know it by that name. That's the name of the actual high school where I believe over 20 students and faculty actually lost their lives. And as you know, there's hundreds of students, thousands of students that survived that. And then there's these ones that were really, really close to the victims, whether it's close in proximity or even close in terms of relationships, right? They will feel survivor's remorse. They will feel guilty. They may feel like, man, why was it them and not me? And they feel as though the life that they have in front of them isn't warranted, isn't valid. Therefore, they should not be taking advantage of all the goodness, if you will, of this life that this life has to offer, right? So it's feeling like a sense of like guilt, a feeling like you're not as worthy, if you will. Now, that is just one example, right? One may say that's a very extreme example, but there's tons of other examples. I think one example that I've seen from some of my clients is it comes from their family background. Sometimes it's not even them. It's because they came from a family that was in poverty or that suffered from addictions, or maybe it's a family that are immigrants, right? So maybe they're firstborn Americans, if you will. A lot of times they may come with this sense of worthlessness. And I'm not saying that's everybody. I'm just saying I've seen this from a small few. They may feel like they're not as good enough as people who haven't come from those backgrounds, and thus feel as though they're not good enough. They feel like they're not as worthy. There's so many different examples of this, and I think all of us as humans, to a degree, we struggle with the sense of I'm not good enough. It may be in a specific area, so I'm not good enough in terms of basketball, business, being a husband, being a wife. Like there's different areas, if you will, where we may feel that to a degree, but it's more so like if you feel like that overall, right? Overall, like who you are at your soul is not good enough. All right, so be on the lookout for that. So this eighth one is something that I saw a lot in the rehab centers that I used to work in when I first got licensed as a therapist. And this is when people had a diminished ability to think or to even concentrate. Something that was very common from the people who were going through their sobriety journey was that they would tell me, Coach, man, back in the day, like I was sharp. I mean, my brain used to work on a high level. And these would be people who had high level careers. There's even one guy who I remember was a very esteemed lawyer, right? Came from the West Coast, right? Came from California. And unfortunately, due to, having back pains, right? And it's because he slipped and fell off a roof. He was prescribed opioids, right? So oxycodone, I believe it was. And from there, he got addicted to them. And it really has caused a tough time in his life. I'll just put it like that. But something like that is just so common for a lot of people that struggles with addictions, if you will. And from there, it makes it hard for them to critically think, because there will be times where I would give them journal prompts or I ask them very in-depth questions, and it'll take them a little while to conjure up the answers or to even remember the verbiage or the memories from those previous times. So again, a diminished ability to critically think. I've also seen this when I worked as a high school counselor as well, where it was very common to see kids who recently lost a parent or going through a breakup or whatever the case it may be, go through a tough time, right? And I'll tell you what I mean by this. I would see students who would have A's across the board, right? A's across the board for the first semester. And then second semester would come and I'm seeing D's and F's. When we see that, we will grab that kid, pull them out of class and ask them, hey, what's up? What's going on? And 9 times out of 10, there would be something going on in their personal life, right? From the examples that I gave, right? So losing a parent, right? Maybe a parent's divorced. Maybe they were recently abused, or something that was tough during the pandemic was them losing their homes, right? Them finding that, mom, dad lost their jobs, so now we're having to move in with other family members. Things like that could be really, really hard for kids, for you, for whoever. So this will help, this will hurt your ability to critically think. And then the last one, a classic one, is reoccurring thoughts about death or having simply suicidal thoughts. Before I go into this one, if you fall into this category, there's a great app that I would love for you to download. It's called the Suicide Safety Plan app. This is something that I give to all my clients who have ever expressed suicidal thoughts. On this app, you can create your personalized safety plan. And then from there, on the last page, you have all the different resources that you can reach out to, such as the suicide hotline. They have a text line. But my favorite part is when you click on a button that says nearby hospitals, nearby safety places, things like that. It will show you all the nearby hospitals, emergency departments, all those things that if you're feeling suicidal, you can go to, and it will use your location to find the nearest one. Therefore, you're never out of reach of help. Okay. So that is a great app that I would love for you to use. So again, if you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, this is a clear sign that you may be suffering from depression, if you will. And here's something to help you to see like if things are getting serious, right? So not only having the thoughts, but if you're coming up with a plan, or if you have intentions on acting on the plan, or if you even have a history of attempting suicide. These are all things that will raise a red flag that you may be suffering from depression. And if you find yourself having these thoughts again, I would tell you, don't wait for these other symptoms. That is a clear sign that you need to go and find a therapist. So with that being said, if you or someone that you know is struggling with these signs, I would first tell you to have them reach out to me, or even yourself, because I've had experience working with entrepreneurs and working professionals who are struggling in this area of their life. So all you got to do is look at the links below. You can reach out to me. Also, you can just simply email me. So it's phillipwells@theplayerscoach.net, or just simply go to my website, theplayerscoach.com. So these are the 9 different symptoms of depression. And again, remember, there's a big difference between depression and being sad. All right, guys, I'll see you later, and take care. And thanks for checking this out.